there is a very large proportion of the global population that remembers something entirely different. And it all stems from the death, or not the death, of Nelson Mandela, hence the name, the Mandela effect. So what I'm putting up on the screen at the moment are obviously some examples of those subtle changes in history, or it could be changes in memory, who knows, of the Mandela effects taking place all over the world. Even more people have postulated that the Mandela effect is, or created a glitch in time when they run the Hadron Collider at CERN, and they are literally resetting details in our history. There are plenty of channels on the subject, so that's not my focus for today, but there are all sorts of reasons of why the Mandela effect would take place, but the CERN connection seems to be the strongest one amongst those believers. For me personally, if the effect is being felt globally, then it's not an isolated system, in which case I must admit it does point towards not just CERN, but in case you didn't know, there are hundreds of colliders across the planet that are connected to either the energy grid, not just the internet energy grid and the Wi-Fi grid, but the Earth energy grid. And they all run Hadron Colliders. CERN is just the famous one, but it's not necessarily, it's definitely not the only one. So as you saw there, there are such things as book titles changing, logos being different as to what we remember them to be, one-liners now never said in epic movies. Known products of decades ago seem to change either the colour or the shape or the logo or the text, and many point towards changes in textual side of things almost everywhere, including some people claiming that the Bible's actually changed. But all these things cited as evidence, and they may well be true, but for me sounds like one could easily fall into some negative crowd psychology here. If the change is subtle enough, it will be sufficiently vague as the individual memory that any suggestions of a small difference has a better chance of filling that gap of memory as any good real thing. And to be honest with you, that was my go-to explanation until I started to come across my own evidence. And since those who believe the Mandela effect is a real thing, individual instances of changes do really begin to build a credible case. But if you've got a global coverage on such a huge scale, that took place across the planet, well, that would probably seal the deal for most of us. My personal Mandela confirmation is the image you're looking at right now, which is obviously JFK. And for the love of me, I do not remember anyone else inside that car apart from those in the front seat and JFK and Jackie in the back seat. But apparently that's not true. Obviously, you have your own memories of this, but it certainly doesn't fit mine. So now you've got a pretty good overview of what the Mandela effect is, and there are some fantastic videos out on the internet, and I'll probably pop a couple of links in below if you want to go check them out for yourselves. But I want to keep the idea of the Mandela effect in your mind as we move to the next one, because the next one, which is the Great Mud Flood, is not so subtle. And I want to take a closer dive into the mud flood and the evidence for it, and then we're going to link that back to the Mandela effect. So what is the Great Mud Flood? So for those of you who've not heard about this, and I'm not surprised if you haven't, you'll understand why in a second. So let me just start by asking the question, would it be possible to hide a complete history, such a recent complete history kept as a complete secret? What if I told you we had an entirely different history up until 250 years ago? And prior to that era, there was a civilization which has been almost eradicated from the history books, maps and references, and even erased from a collective consciousness. Welcome to the Mud Flood. Well, according to all the evidence, they've managed in less than 4 generations to remove almost all references to whatever the pre-civilization was prior to the mud flood. Now I say pre-civilization because we're not just talking about covering up a global event, because although a lot of these pictures are from Russia, there's clear evidence in Australia, the Americas, the United Kingdom, all over Europe. It's absolutely everywhere. There is clearly worldwide evidence. You can check it for yourself. And this evidence comes from all corners of the planet. Indicates a biblical style mud flood of global proportions. It's buried great cities, wiped out millions of people, and literally reset the whole of modern civilization less than 250 years ago. Now, you can imagine just after a calamity as large as this on such a scale, and having had most of the population, or at least a large proportion of the population, wiped out, they needed to repopulate. They needed to redistribute people to those areas that were worst affected in order to reset civilization as we now know it. And as you've seen clearly there, the evidence is all over the world in terms of the buildings and the evidence of the flood actually being there. So what do we do after such a calamity? Well, we distribute our people, or the people that have got left, and unfortunately most of those people were children. Which brings me to the next piece of evidence that fits perfectly with the mud flood theory, and that is, in case any of you have ever heard of the phrase orphan trains. Now, the orphan trains weren't just literally trains full of orphans, obviously, and they were literally shipped around and sold as members of the new family all over the world. But obviously the Americas and the West at the turn of the 19th century have got a lot of press as regards the orphan trains, but I can assure you they were in Russia. The children were shipped out to Australia, all over the world, in order to rebuild a civilization that had just suffered a global cataclysmic event that we now know as the mud flood. Now, as you can see from these 19th century images I've managed to dig up, the orphan trains were real. The idea of orphanages and fledglings, which is, you know, obviously young children, they're being resettled all over the world. And the number of children being resettled goes into the hundreds of thousands. So if we take a look at some of the actual evidence of these orphan trains repopulating areas, and you know, people asking for money, or one of the reasons that there were so many children is independent governments. We're talking like Europe, Russia, Americas, brought out a new law all around the same time, which was the late 1850s, 1860s, and early into the 19th century, that all unwedded mothers should hand their children into the authorities so they can find a home for them. So technically, these were not orphan children. These were children that was taken away from their unmarried parents in order to repopulate other areas of the globe that had been affected by this huge mud flood. The children riding the trains, basically being sold to people on farms, children that were brought to orphanages. There was even like post office boxes where you could drop your child off, no questions asked, and be on your merry way. These children were shipped, as I say, all over the world. And to be honest with you, we all know the stories about how the Australian girls and the Irish girls were abused as children when they were shipped out and over in Australia. So there are horror stories all over the world, but the point being is, in this context, they were used to repopulate those areas that had been hit hardest by the Great Mud Flood. And it seems to coincide exactly, which is why I've got the date 1847 or thereabouts, because both dates, the mud flood and a couple of years later, once people had got themselves together, the coupling of those shipping those orphanage children around the world seems to match perfectly. It seems clear that the sudden rise in orphan trains and the roots of an awful lot of these orphanages, and even the Victorian workhouses, they were all a global effort to repopulate as late as the 1870s, moving into the 1900s. The question is, if you are having to employ kids to do all the hard manual work, where are all the adults? Where are the skillful masons which are supposed to have built these great cities? All we are reading about in the history books is about the children, and photographs, as you'll notice, of the older cities don't seem to have any population in it whatsoever. It's almost as if something had wiped out most of the adult population, as you can see quite clearly in a couple of these images. They're empty. The streets are empty. I mean, why would you build such grand buildings and wide streets for so very few people? Unless, of course, they were populated previously. Which brings us to the obvious question then, well, if they were populated previously, who built them. The question of who built them is probably a little bit more difficult, but we can still postulate that, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But the other question is, why would they cover it up? Which seems to be a little bit easier to answer. Some of the leading researchers on the MudFlood have postulated their own ideas, and I tend to agree with them. So here it is. Prior to the MudFlood, humanity had finally got around to working with each other unanimously, with the ability to produce free, limitless energy, similar to what Tesla postulated, but I'll jump back to that in a little while. And they lived in balance with the planet and make sure that the global population had shelter, was well fed, and the energy was transmitted via Wi-Fi, similar to Tesla's tower, to every residence, every building, in ways that we can't understand at the moment. So the bottom line is, why would they reset the MudFlood? Well, my guess is that the new system that we call capitalism was an ideal time for these people to reset modern humanity and start charging, making a profit obviously, from the energy that was previously free. Now you might think this is crazy, but before we go any further on that, I want to take a quick look at the civilization many believe were the forefathers of these magnificent cities. Some of them are called star cities, as I'll show you in a little while. Others of them have called them by their name, which is Tartarians or Tartarians, whatever you want to say it. But the great empire of Tartaria or Tartaria spread across most of Europe, and their architecture can be seen absolutely everywhere, all over the planet. And as I said, the one thing that they had was free energy, allegedly. I tend to believe them because it gives a damn good reason why anybody would want to reset a civilization that was once not metered on electricity to one that now has to pay for everything, including the advent of the oil industry to make more profit at the sacrifice of the planet. Whereas the previous civilization, pre-MudFlood, so we're looking at the 16th, 17th centuries, these people had no use of oil, no need of oil, because they were literally pulling electricity out of the ether. So just to reiterate, we've now covered the Mandela effect, where reality seems to change. We've covered the MudFlood, the Orphan Trains, and now you've seen this hidden history of T.A.R.T.A.R.I.A. And we believe that T.A.R.T.A.R.I.A. were the forerunners and architects and engineers that created the civilization prior to the MudFlood. Which brings me to the last point before I consolidate and join all the dots, as if you haven't already joined them. I'm going to round all of this up and why it's all relevant to each other in a very short while. But just before I consolidate all that, just remember to subscribe, like, press the bell so you know when my next upload is, and I'll move on with the final section now of the last dot, should I say, because I believe that the inventions of Nikola Tesla were in fact Tartarian known knowledge, maybe in book form, whatever, and Tesla was in fact Tartarian himself, or well, at least he was born in Tartaria, according to the maps, or very close to it, because we don't exactly know how far their empire stretched, but we do know they had lots of star cities, which you've seen earlier on the video there. But the point being is that Tesla would have been influenced, or at least his father, his grandfather, his whole family tree would have been influenced by the Tartarian Empire. And if the Tartarian Empire had free energy and other completely different ways of living apart from capitalism, then Tesla would have had access to it, especially if his own knowledge and interest was in engineering. It seems a bit more of a coincidence, as you can see from some of these images, and this one in particular dates back to the 16th century. These are actually Chinese ships, and that sure as heck looks like a Tesla tower. In other words, it's pulling energy. It's an electric ship. Nobody's actually sailing it. Nobody's rowing it. So you've got to ask yourself that something that looks like a Tesla tower there, something that looks like a Tesla tower well, we've come to know what Tesla towers look like, but all of these small little baubles come to know what Tesla towers look like, but all of these small little baubles and some of the old flagpoles, people postulate that these were the things that drew the electricity back out of the air. So you had Wi-Fi electricity. The fireplaces, as you can see there, of old were not actually used to burn coals, but they were that back metal plate heated up, because on lots of these fireplaces there is no soot, no fire was ever burnt in there, and the two front iron stances that you see there conducted again the Wi-Fi electricity around the property, both heating it and transferring it to other rooms of the house. So I'm guessing that Tesla did have access or to some knowledge of these previous civilizations. I might even believe Tesla was giving us the means to fight back in a passive sense, like, look, here's what was, okay, so try and get this out there, use it. But unfortunately he was shut down, and the powers to be that used the MudFlood for this reset to make profit purely for greed, that was their chance to actually take control of the planet and try and eradicate any histories connected to Tartaria, the MudFlood. We don't want to talk about the Orphan Trains to repopulate after the Great Flood, or because we just simply don't want you to know about the reset. So all but a few records now remain of Tartaria, the empire, the pre-MudFlood of the mid-18th century. I said 1847, but I'm, you know, edging my bets a few years either side, but around about that time. So you can begin to connect the dots yourself. And the last dot that I want to connect, which is the biggest one, is the Mandela effect. Because having said all this against bankers and those people who wanted to reset our system again, those who wanted to profit from our greed, the other effect, which is why I mentioned it right at the beginning, the Mandela effect, it could well be the world's largest Mandela effect. And not even those who reset it actually realized it was a Mandela effect. So if you will, the best way to describe it is that if there was a twist in time, because the Tartarian Empire was spread globally, it was like leaking time all over the place, little clues. So those subtle changes, i.e. most of them will wipe it from the history books, but all of these other little bits and pieces are left, similar to the logos and, you know, these small minutiae of changes that have taken place. The MudFlood could be exactly that, a massive global Mandela effect that has left clues for us to find, small ones on their own, but as an accumulative ball of knowledge, overwhelming evidence that there was a MudFlood, there was a cover-up. The system changed from a free system to a system where you have to pay to play. Now, I haven't got time today to go into all the details of how they initially set the system up, because, you know, it would take too long. But just think for a moment, did Tesla come up with all of the those ideas himself? Could he possibly have been a Tartarian? Did he have previous knowledge and access to that information, which would have been common knowledge, everyday knowledge, like we use a mobile phone, and he simply migrated over to America way after the MudFlood, maybe he was aware of it, and tried to resurrect Tartarian technology? I don't know, I'm speculating on this, but I'll leave those questions for you. And could the MudFlood be one huge glitch in the matrix as a Mandela effect? I look forward to the next time I see you. Please leave comments what you think about anything that I've presented for you today. But now you can see why the MudFlood, the Mandela effect, what my thoughts on Nikola Tesla actually is, with access to information rather than coming out from scratch himself. Not that I'm taking any away from the grand man that is Nikola Tesla. I've been a fan of his since I was a kid. So just think about all of this information and moving children all over the world, and you try and sit there and say to yourself, no, we haven't had a reset. And just to leave you on one final note, and please remember to hit that bell like the video and subscribe. See you soon.